Now, my experience of speaking to these gatherings in Victoria is that many of you are here because something happened to you. It's Victoria. We don't have a lot of lifelong conservatives, not a lot of ranchers whose dad was an organizer for the Progressive Conservatives. You're a lifelong progressive. Your hero was Tommy Douglas, and probably still is. You were at the rallies for gay marriage. But then, something happened. You realized that a lot of what you assumed about Canada wasn't true, and you probably learned it in a very horrifying way. Maybe you or a family member was a victim of a violent crime, and you witnessed a justice system that was actively not interested in delivering justice, and pretty conspicuously prioritized the intergenerational trauma of the criminal over the random person he maimed or killed. Maybe you had a medical problem and realized that despite living in Canada, you couldn't actually get any of this free health care people keep talking about. Or, and I've seen this a few times, someone close to you get taken in by the trans cult and they now refuse to talk to you because you won't affirm their authentic self. I suspect they invited me here because, as mentioned, I wrote the book, Don't Be Canada. The rough synopsis of the book is that in a contemporary political era defined by bad ideas, Canada fell for these bad ideas harder than anyone else. Gender ideology, harm reduction, assisted suicide, permanent real estate bubbles, unsustainable immigration, justice systems that utterly refuse to appropriately punish violent crime. Everybody, at least in the West, fell for these a little bit, but we Canadians took them, crushed them into a powder, and snorted them off the diaper change table at a gas station bathroom. I'm sure you're familiar with the main bullet points. More of our citizens die each year from euthanasia than anywhere else on Earth. We're officially number one. We're also the only country on Earth where the medical system treats death as just another form of treatment. Canadian doctors and nurses are required by protocol to inform patients whenever they have the option of killing themselves in lieu of seeking treatment. We are the only country where this is the case. Most other places, it's illegal. If you're an Australian doctor who brings up assisted dying unsolicited, expect to be arrested. Speaking of healthcare, we have the worst wait times and the lowest bed-to-patient ratios than anyone else in the developed world, and this is despite spending more on healthcare than almost anyone else except the Americans. If you compare the number of Americans who die because they don't have health insurance to the number of Canadians who die waiting for care, it's not even close. In terms of people who die because they are unable to access healthcare, we blew past the United States a long time ago. One thing I learned writing this book is that a big contributor to the catastrophic state of Canadian healthcare is that we are the only country that makes it illegal to purchase private insurance for any procedure covered by the government. Nobody else does that, not even China. The only other healthcare system I could find that had something similar was Cuba or North Korea. Our rate of fatal overdoses is worse than any other country, and this is despite, arguably, because we leaned into so-called harm reduction harder than any other place on Earth. Go to your wussiest, most socialist corner of Europe, and I assure you that nobody else is handing out bottomless free drugs and also finding a constitutional right to do those drugs in a playground. Immigration is completely off the chain. Nobody else anywhere has overseen the overnight destruction of its immigration system quite like Canada. In about 10 years, we went from a well-managed, skill-oriented immigration system that was the envy of the world to a place that had effectively thrown open its borders, bringing in millions of unvetted, low-skilled men from the developing world. To this day, even after we've dialed down the utterly sky-high immigration of 2021 to 2024, we're still bringing in people at a rate that isn't anywhere close to sustainable. It's already caused the further deterioration of the housing market, the healthcare system, and public safety, and now, more and more, we're seeing the collapse of something far more precious, social cohesion. Very quickly, we've gone from a national consensus of, I've got no problem with immigrants, I see them working hard and trying to integrate, to, why are there a bunch of jihadists praying in the streets of Montreal and Toronto all of a sudden? All of this is in my book, and I cited my footnotes very diligently because I assumed nobody would believe me. The question I'm asked most often about the book is, how the hell did everything get worse all at once? Because nothing was spared. We've never really experienced anything like this. Everything about civic life in Canada right now is worse than it was in 2015. The only exception I've ever been able to find, and maybe you have some suggestions, is that cell phone bills are a bit cheaper than they were back then. So I have a few theories as to why this is, but it basically comes down to Canada was so good for so long that we took everything for granted. We no longer saw prosperity as something that needed to be nurtured and defended. We could chip it away at it with red tape and taxes and equity quotas for the rest of time, and it wouldn't affect our productivity or our quality of life. Our immigration system was so well managed that we had the best version of everyone. Vietnamese, Ukrainian, Chinese, Sub-Saharan African, Brazilian, our immigrants were skilled professionals, they owned businesses, they spoke perfect English, and they were front of the line on Canada Day. And so we figured that everyone in the world was like this, and we could just let in whoever else wanted to come in whatever numbers without any expectation of integration, and it would all be fine. Crime had been in steady decline for decades, basically my entire adult life. And so we figured that Canadians had just decided to stop being criminals, and we could stop doing icky things like putting people in jail or denying them bail, and there would be no consequence for that. We became a nation of people that had never really had anything bad happen to them, and we lost all imagination for the idea that bad things could happen. We had no immunity to bad ideas, and that's why bad ideas hit here harder than anywhere else. There are 8 chapters in Don't Be Canada, and each one details an issue that is uniquely extreme in Canada. And in each chapter, I tried to trace the origins of where it came from. I could trace most things back to a specific law or a specific court decision, and in almost every case, you had unbelievably disruptive policies being implemented with little to no controversy whatsoever. In 2015, the Supreme Court released the Carter v. Canada decision, which went way beyond merely legalizing euthanasia for the terminally ill. They could have done that, but instead they wrote the decision so broadly that it effectively made death a human right. You're an 11-year-old who wants to die because you have anxiety. The Supreme Court said, yeah, maybe. Look through the public discourse at the time, and outside of some Catholic circles, absolutely nobody was pointing out how insane this was. Or that, say, it could lead to a situation in which sociopathic health workers were telling veterans or poor people to kill themselves. This is a direct quote from the Carter v. Canada decision. We should not lightly assume that the regulatory regime will function defectively. It was essentially, we're Canadian, we're special, we can legalize assisted dying with almost no safeguards whatsoever, and it will be fine. And you see the same phenomenon with much of the legislation that put in place self-ID laws in terms of gender. That is, your gender is whatever you say it is at any time, and the government has to take your word for it. Anybody with any amount of skepticism could have seen this was inviting an avalanche of potentially disastrous consequences. I'm sorry, you're saying I can just declare I'm a woman, and then I can go to the women's change room and join the women's Olympic team and get transferred to a women's prison? But here again, almost no pushback. If you were writing a news story in 2012, as I was, and you wanted to find a skeptical voice to the new self-ID policy sweeping the nation, some conservative politician or women's rights advocate who's going to articulate why it's a bad idea, that person didn't exist. Canadians nodded along to the adoption of anti-racism within our top institutions, with most people seemingly thinking it was just some new form of racial sensitivity training. But little did they know, they were bringing in an unbelievably toxic worldview which holds that any differential outcome is inherently evidence of white supremacy and can only be cured with special treatment for equity-deserving groups. Why are there more white nuclear scientists than black nuclear scientists? White supremacy. The black scientists are clearly being kept out by some vague, immaterial racism. Thus, we have to start hiring black-only nuclear scientists. And that's why, as we speak, UBC is advertising several faculty positions that are limited exclusively to black candidates. So in sum, how did everything in Canada break all at once? It's that quote you probably keep seeing on social media. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. And we had the weakest men of anyone, the weakest men of all time. I don't think it's a coincidence that right as everything started to go to hell, Canada hit the milestone as the most educated country in the world, and probably in history. And by educated, I mean that we had the most people with university degrees. We took hundreds of thousands of people who should have been tradies or farmers or truck drivers and told them to get useless degrees, and now what's resulted is about to be expected. The other question I get all the time about this book is what we're going to do about all this. Or, this happens basically every day, someone usually an old guy named Mike, will just announce to me that Canada is done and beyond saving and it's too late. I hate Mike. Mike is a defeatist wuss, and he's also wrong. I understand how easy it is to feel helpless, to feel like the country you knew is slipping away, and worst of all, that so many of your countrymen seem to think everything is fine and keep voting for it at every chance they get. We've all had that experience of speaking to someone reasonably intelligent, someone we trusted, and realizing that they don't get it at all. It doesn't matter how many charts you show them about real estate prices, they think houses are just as affordable as they were in 1981. It doesn't matter how many images you show them of masked young men screaming in Arabic for intifada in our major cities, including here in Victoria, they think it's just some Middle Eastern thing that will probably blow over. All that said, I want you to appreciate the progress that has been made. Even if there's still an NDP government down the street and a Liberal government in Ottawa, we are already in a Canada that is wildly different from where it was just 5 years ago. Things have gotten so bad so quickly that a whole bunch of issues that you didn't used to be able to touch with a 10-foot pole are now up for discussion. You've probably heard the term 80-20 issue. This is where a progressive institution or political party holds on with both hands to an idea despite the fact that only about 20% of the population supports it. Canada has lots of 80-20 issues, and more every day. The idea that teachers should be required to secretly transition gender-confused children against the wishes of their parents. 80-20. The notion that light sentences and easy bail is the most effective way to address violent crime. 80-20. The notion that newcomers to Canada shouldn't be expected to adhere to a common set of shared values. 80-20. Among recent immigrants, it's probably 90-10. The idea that maybe it was a bad idea to have all of our entry-level jobs performed by a temporary underclass of minimum wage foreigners that we can deport once we're done with them. 80-20. Canadians have even started to break on one of our most electrified third rails of politics, healthcare reform. For the first time basically ever, you now have polls showing a majority of Canadians supporting the idea that at the very least, we need two-tier healthcare. Canada is also home to a whole latticework of heterodox institutions and voices that did not exist only a few years ago. In the mid-2010s, if you were writing a news story about, say, safe injection sites, it was virtually impossible to find a voice willing to speak critically against them. Any health organization you called, any medical professor, would just back the party line that the science supports this, safe injection saves lives, and makes neighborhoods safer. This code of omerta is no longer the case. You've got the Macdonald-Laurier Institute doing yeoman's work on the extremes of gender ideology, including on the issue of women's sports. Alberta has now pursued a path of treatment-based drug policy as a direct challenge to the policy of harm reduction uber alles, present everywhere else. When a Canadian is hammered for wrongthink by one of Canada's various kangaroo courts, be it a human rights tribunal or an ideologically captured professional licensing body, they have places to turn to that didn't used to be available to them. Like the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, the group defending Amy Ham, the BC nurse dragged through a legal odyssey for saying publicly that there are only two sexes. You've now got a whole archipelago of independent media that is shining light into places where the mainstream media fears to tread. Juno News, The Hub, any number of independent podcasters and YouTubers who are posting larger numbers than any CBC personality. Remember when the entire country woke up to news that a Samadoun demonstration in Vancouver had concluded with a ritual burning of the Canadian flag and chants of death to Canada? You didn't hear about that because of CBC or CTV or even the great and mighty and benevolent Post Media that I work for. You only heard about it because Jared Yager, lately of the Western Standard, was there with a camera. If he hadn't been there, we would never have known about it. And one last point of optimism for people worried about Canada's future. The young people, none of whom appear to be here, are done with this. Oh, he's young. Canada by my read. Canada by my read. This is actually the only thing this is the first gathering I've been to that wasn't disproportionately young, which is wildly different from what conservative gatherings looked like only 10 years ago. Because Canada by my read is now the only Western country on earth in which the average 20-year-old is now more likely to vote for a conservative option than the average 70-year-old. We're seeing that both on the provincial and federal level. That's never happened before. There's been periods, you saw it with Margaret Thatcher, you saw it with Brian Mulroney, you saw it with Ronald Reagan, where a plurality of young people will vote for a Conservative option, but never at higher rates than seniors. So that happening in Canada, I've never seen that ever happen in any Western country, at least in the last 100 years. But to me, the most startling example of this phenomenon were the results of the 2025 Civics High School election poll. The Canadian electorate picked a Liberal government. The high schoolers picked a Conservative one, which means if you'd only had teenagers voting in the most recent federal election, Pierre Poilievre would be Prime Minister right now. Now, why is this? The normal pattern among young voters is that lacking life experience, they pine for some abstract utopia. That's why you normally get disproportionate amounts of 20-something voters backing socialist or far-right options. But in Canada, the utopia is the world of 20 years ago. I grew up right here in Victoria, and I know the windows that didn't used to have bars on them, the alleyways that didn't used to be blockaded with barbed wire, the parks that didn't have tent encampments in them. Even for Gen Zers who can't remember the 1990s, they keep finding artifacts and clues to what once was. They get their first real job and notice that every coworker over 40 was able to buy a house on a normal salary, while anybody younger is crammed into a $3,000 a month apartment with roommates. In the forgotten corners of their school library, they can find outdated literature that instructs teenagers not to do drugs, rather than simply ensure that their meth pipe is properly sanitized beforehand. They can watch old newsreels about Expo 86 and wonder why it shows children being entertained by clowns and puppets instead of drag queens. And they're not just pissed off that they can't find a house. Recently, the Angus Reid Institute found that religious observation among Canadian 20-somethings is higher than among seniors. That's definitely never happened before. And if you know any churchgoers, they'll confirm this. Unless they go to the United Church or one of those other kafia hippie churches. They are seeing increasing numbers of young people who feel rootless, who feel like they have no identity, and they're turning to the old ways. So that's the good news. But what are you going to do about fixing it? I encounter a lot of impotence, shall we say. People saying, I know this is wrong. I don't know what's happened to the country I know, but what the hell am I supposed to do about it? These guys are probably going to tell you that you should get into politics, knock on doors, hand out flyers, get in a common sense government, and they'll fix everything. I'm not going to argue that. I think the most good you can do is at a more grassroots level. Because politicians can only do what they can get away with. The federal Conservatives didn't talk about immigration at all 3 years ago. Now they're talking about suspending immigration entirely and actively tweaking the system to start considering the cultural compatibility of people who come here. Radical stuff. But the only reason that changed is because they got a permission structure to do so. Enough people like yourselves changed the conversation at a cultural level that it became a safe topic for them to tackle. Canada, as my book gets into, was broken at the grassroots level. Justin Trudeau accelerated a lot of the bad ideas I've detailed, but he didn't invent any of them. And if it was broken at the grassroots, it can be fixed at the grassroots. You have to be a missionary for normalcy, a kind, patient, approachable, and polite figure to stand as a beacon for all the millions of Canadians who feel like they're alone in seeing the same problems and decay that you do. And you have to start providing friction against the people causing the damage. You roll your eyes at the fact that your public library has 14 Progress pride flags on display, but did you ever ask them to take them down? Don't get mad. Just say, I'm a 55-year-old gay man, and I assume most of this audience is gay, you usually are, and I find all the pride flags alienating and divisive. You sit on your hands through the land acknowledgements at work, but have you ever stood up and said, I think these declarations about unceded territory are condescending to First Nations people. Maybe we could just start the meeting by noting the name of the nearest First Nation. You log onto your neighborhood forum on Facebook and you see someone mouthing off about how harm reduction saves lives. Have you replied and told them that you're 30 years sober and that you thank God nobody ever told you to just drink yourself to death in a low-barrier hotel suite somewhere? You're not going to convince that person, but the other people on that forum are going to see what you're doing and they're going to feel less alone and more emboldened in their ideas. How many times did you refuse to take a board position or speak to a city council or volunteer for some civic duty because it was a ball ache and you had better things to do? Well, who took the position instead? It was probably some nutbag drunk leftist with toxoplasmosis. You went to Remembrance Day and you saw a speaker in a keffiyeh. Did you tell anyone that the keffiyeh is a symbol of Palestinian terror and is an insult to thousands of Canadians who died fighting against political extremism?